Chapter 2. A Marriage Made in Paradise. Moses' Certificate of Divorce. Have you heard the one about Adam and his spare rib? Well, as you know, in the beginning, God made Adam and put him in paradise. Adam was allowed to enjoy all the many wonders of the Garden of Eden and was given the job of naming all the animals. But after he had named them, rather a long task, he got bored. He wanted some company, someone he could talk to and impress. God understood the situation perfectly. "I can see that you're lonely," he said to Adam. "Let me make a woman for you." "What's a woman?" asked Adam. "A woman will love and adore you. She'll cook perfect meals and always look nice. She'll laugh at all your jokes and she'll never complain." "That's wonderful," said Adam with enthusiasm, "but she sounds very expensive. What will she cost me?" "Ah," replied God, "a woman like that will cost you an arm and a leg." Adam considered this carefully for a moment, then turned back to his Maker. "What will I get for one rib?" God's perfect plan. Okay, so men aren't perfect either, and we certainly don't live in paradise anymore. Are we asking the impossible of marriage? Can we really live happily with each other's imperfections and strange, annoying habits, let alone our tendency toward downright selfishness? Even if we start off feeling that our partner can do no wrong, doesn't that phrase, "the honeymoon period," sum up the truth that the blissful period of perfect love and contentment is but a short stage quickly passed through? The truth is that marriage is hard work, and many are often far from successful. Marriages started to fail with Adam and Eve. When they were thrown out of paradise because of their disobedience, they soon encountered difficulties. And their reduced circumstances were the least of their problems, for they themselves had changed, for the worse. They had both discovered the difference between good and evil, and at the heart of this discovery was the desire to do what they wanted. This wasn't necessarily what God or the other person wanted, and it immediately led to conflict. Like many couples, they found that having children didn't bring them closer together. It's hard enough for two people to want the same thing at the same time, but when there are 3 or 4 people in the family, it becomes more and more difficult for them all to agree, especially when the children start growing into independent adults. Family gatherings, such as mealtimes, often become battlegrounds. One admittedly tongue-in-cheek definition of the family is a group of individuals who are united by a common TV set. As a family increases and starts to fragment, the number of TVs it owns also increases. To take the analogy back to early times, a family could be identified as a group that sat around the same campfire. When members of the family started to sit at different fires, relationships had clearly gone seriously wrong. It wasn't long before Adam's camp had a whole constellation of fires. God is realistic about the problems of individuals living together, and from the beginning he had a plan designed to help couples stay together. A plan that goes some way to dealing with our quarrelsome individualism. Genesis 2:24. "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." In other words, God says when a couple gets married, they must leave their parents' home and set up a new home of their own. This sounds like very simple advice, but it is effective and, in fact, was quite countercultural for people of Old Testament times. 2 adults have more than enough trouble living together happily without 24 hours a day of helpful comments from their parents. There is a second part to God's instructions, and the first part works only if we follow this as well. When you get married, whatever happens, stick together as though you were one person. If the advice is followed, a man and a woman will get married and commit themselves to each other totally. They will promise to stay together and try to act like one person. God tells them to leave both their family homes and make a new home, and he makes sure that no one else joins them for at least 9 months. When the new person does arrive, he or she will only gradually develop an independent will, so that the couple has time to get used to having another individual being alongside them with differing needs and expectations. Children soon become individuals, of course. They quickly find out how to say no when they don't want to do something. They learn how to argue, and then as teenagers they begin to think seriously and may reject a lot of what their parents tell them. It's not too long before they start to notice the opposite sex, and then before the parents know it, they have found someone they want to marry. After a painfully expensive, though joyous wedding, things get better. The newlyweds leave mom and dad to set up home together, and the conflicts and frustrations experienced between parent and child are resolved. They find that their parents can be friends and confidants rather than oppressive tyrants, and God's wisdom is proved once more. But in practice... Well, that's the theory, but more often than not, it seems that marriages go wrong. Children stay at home longer now, mainly because education takes longer. Couples don't always start out having a home just to themselves for even 9 months. And they don't always learn how to accommodate each other, let alone their children. They end up battling with each other and their children rather than communicating and negotiating. Sadly, but all too commonly, people stop trying to resolve their differences and give up on their relationship instead. Children run away, or, more often, one of the parents walks out. Often, one parent has left long before the teenage battles with the children start because they couldn't learn to live with their partner. The cruel world of the ancient Near East. The state of marriage today is certainly not healthy, but we would be wrong to assume that marriage problems are just a modern disease. Some of the most ancient laws open our eyes to historical problems within marriages. King Hammurabi, who ruled ancient Babylon in 1800 BC, is best remembered for his 282 laws carved on an 8-foot-high stone monument. To our minds, some of these laws were rather brutal. For example, King Hammurabi's Law number 21. If one citizen tunnels through the wall of another's house and robs it, then the citizen is sentenced to death. The execution shall take place outside the tunnel, and the body shall be used to fill the tunnel. Nonetheless, these laws did mark the beginning of impartial justice. Instead of relying on the arbitrary decision of a ruler or a judge, everyone knew what punishment would be meted out for each crime, and they also knew what was and wasn't a crime. This system of laws solved many social problems, assigning punishments for criminals and compensation for victims. But they still left a host of difficulties and even created some new ones. For example, the system didn't help abandoned women, for a man was still allowed to walk out on his wife and children at any time without having to leave her any money or property or pay her any maintenance. In fact, the law actually made things worse for her than before. It said that if her husband came back, he could reclaim her and the children. The Middle Assyrian law from 1400 BC was a little more humane than all the other laws of the ancient Near East, in that it did allow an abandoned wife to be free after 5 years. Imagine that you are a wife in the time of Moses or before. Your husband goes off with some friends to a market in another town, and his friends return without him. They report that he has fallen for a pretty young woman. Later they bring you a message from him. He isn't coming back, but you can keep the children and stay in the house he built, and good luck! This isn't very comforting, and it's only the beginning of your nightmare. If you don't find work, your family will soon starve and freeze. If you have enough land around the house for crops and sheep, it's possible to grow food, spin wool, and barter for other goods, but all this is very hard work, especially for a single mother. Unless you have grown sons who are strong enough to work the land without the help of tractors and weed killer, you have very few choices. There are few professions for women, so either you have to go back to your parents' home if they are still alive, or you have to get married again so that your new husband can work the land and teach your sons. It's very difficult, however, for you to get remarried when the law says that your original husband can reclaim you at any time and can also reclaim your children. He might wait till your children have become economically useful workers and then decide to enforce his rights. This means that your new husband would lose you and his stepchildren, whom he had spent several years supporting, feeding, and training. Any man who married you would have to accept this as a very real possibility, and so your chances of finding a new husband are very small. Moses makes things better. The one place where the law was fairer for abandoned women was Israel. The 10 Commandments came with many other laws that amplified these 10 basic rules. This new code was a remarkable one and was more enlightened than any others in the ancient Near East. For example, in Hammurabi's code, people were not considered equal. If you hurt an ordinary person, you had to pay a fine, but if the person was important, you were punished by being given an equal injury. According to the laws given to Moses, however, if you injured someone, it didn't matter what their rank was. Whoever it was, you were punished by being given the same injury you had given them. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Exodus 21:24. This was the same punishment that was given under Hammurabi's law for harming a high-ranking official. In other words, everyone in Israel was treated with equal respect, and they were all treated as though they were important. For the modern reader, of course, this level of punishment seems barbaric, but it was appropriate for the time, especially when compared with punishments in the surrounding nations, which were often extremely gruesome. The most impressive differences between the laws of Israel and those of other ancient Near Eastern nations were in the laws of remarriage. In other countries, it was difficult for an abandoned woman to get remarried, but in Israel this unfairness was corrected by giving her the right to receive a divorce certificate from her husband. Deuteronomy 24:1. He writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. This certificate had to be given to any woman who was abandoned or thrown out by her husband. It confirmed that her husband had divorced her and meant that it was safe for another man to marry her. He didn't have to worry that her first husband would return one day to demand his wife back. Equality under the law of Moses. In fact, Israelite women were not the only women in the ancient Near East to be given the right to receive such a certificate. Some privileged wives of high-ranking army officers were given a similar certificate if their husbands were missing and presumed dead after a battle. Without a body, it was uncertain if the husband was really dead, and so the wife was not able to remarry, no matter how long he was missing. But the Middle Assyrian law made a special concession for such a wife. After waiting for 2 years without news of her husband, she was given a certificate of widowhood. This contained the words, "You are now free to marry any man you wish." These same words are found in all the Jewish divorce certificates that have survived from the earliest times, and we can therefore presume that these certificates were patterned on something like this ancient concession for war widows of high-ranking officers. All Israelites shared an equal rank in Moses' law. It wasn't just high-ranking women who could have this type of certificate, but any woman whose husband abandoned her. The law of Moses recognized that our sinfulness can end a marriage, and it made sure that women didn't suffer more than could be avoided. I also imagine that the process of writing out a divorce certificate made a lot of men think again and possibly stopped them from making the wrong decision. The fact that Israelite women could be given a divorce certificate doesn't mean that God thinks divorce is a good idea. He designed marriage to last forever, for both the couple's and the children's benefit, and the breakup of a marriage is always a disaster. We have learned, though, that we have to distinguish between marriage breakup, which is always wrong, and divorce, which is the legal recognition that a marriage has broken up. Moses' law did not say that it was acceptable to break up a marriage. It merely prescribed the legal process that was necessary after a breakup had happened. It said that the man couldn't have his cake and eat it. He couldn't abandon his wife and expect her to be waiting for him at a later date. Whatever sin causes the marriage to break up, there should be a clean end. Neither partner should hold the other as a prisoner in a marriage that is dead. Are marriages any better today? At first glance, the New Testament teaching on divorce is very different from the Old Testament teaching. In later chapters, we will find that this is not quite the case. If it were very different, it would suggest that marriage or humanity had changed so that we needed different laws. Unfortunately, the world has not changed much with regard to marriage, because just as many marriages break down now as in biblical times. The true extent of marriage breakup in the modern world was not recognized until the divorce laws were liberalized. Although easier divorce means that some people get divorced unnecessarily, no one divorces when they are happily married. The New Testament world and the modern world have just as many instances of broken marriage vows because they both suffer the same human sinfulness as in the ancient Near East. In the Roman Empire of New Testament times, divorce was very common. People married when they were young, and as the years went by, they were likely to feel differently about each other. It was easy to get divorced, and the law did nothing to discourage it. One partner could just walk out on a marriage without any need to divide up the property or provide maintenance for the children. Things are a little different today, as compulsory financial arrangements help to support the partner who brings up the children, but our society is becoming more and more similar to the Roman society of the first century. Fewer couples are getting married, which means that either partner can simply walk out of the relationship, just as a spouse could walk out of their relationship under Roman law. Conclusion: God's law in an imperfect world. The world that God made, including marriage, was perfect and wonderful, but everything was spoiled when we rebelled and became selfish. God told Adam and Eve that, as a result of their sin, growing food would become difficult and there would be problems in the relationships between men and women. Genesis 3:16-19. Many harvests failed, and many marriages too. When marriages failed, the woman, being more vulnerable, usually suffered most. The law of Moses limited the damage that divorce inflicts by forcing a divorcing man to give his ex-wife a certificate that would allow her to remarry. In the next chapter, we will see that the laws of the Old Testament have even more to say on the subject of a broken marriage, and that they are always on the side of the victim, whether it is the man or the woman.